Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Russian President Vladimir Putin secured a crushing victory in parliamentary elections on Monday. The election was seen as a test for Putin's expected presidential campaign in 2018, with the results showing that the Russian president has a firm grip on power in the country. Meanwhile, international observers criticized the political restrictions on the campaign. What are the factors contributing to United Russia's victory? How will the election change Russia's economy and diplomacy in the future? And why are Western media calling this election managed democracy? Above all, what does the campaign success of President Putin and his party mean for the relationship between Moscow and Beijing? To answer these questions and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Cui Hongjian from the China Institute of International Studies, Alexander Lukin from the Moscow State University of International Relations, and Anna Tangen, author and columnist. But before we begin our discussion, let's look at this.
A result that came as no surprise. The ruling United Russia Party, backed by Vladimir Putin, won the parliamentary election with more than half of the votes. Residents of Crimea were voting in the State Duma for the first time since Russia established control in 2014. The party now gets a constitutional majority in the State Duma, becoming more dominant and ensuring more support for the Russian president than ever. It was seen as a test run for Putin's expected presidential campaign in 2018.
It is hard, it is difficult, but people still vote for the United Russia. I think, what does this tell us? First of all, it tells us that people see that the representatives of the United Russia, the leading political force, are really doing their best for the people.
However, Western media turned a critical eye to this election, which the Financial Times called far from truly free. The New York Times wrote, "The Kremlin says it wants a spotless election, but locally it is marred." In the UN General Assembly, President Obama also sought to use his last appearance to show his tough stance over Russia when speaking of the Syria crisis.
The notion that Syria can somehow return to a pre-war status quo is a fantasy. It's time for Russia and Iran to realize that insisting on Assad's rule will lead directly to the outcome that they fear, an increasingly violent space for extremists to operate.
The speech has stirred hot debate between Russia and the US, and the ceasefire brokered by the two countries hangs in the balance with no better alternative in sight.
Gentlemen, are you surprised that President Obama didn't send a message of congratulations to his Russian counterpart, despite the glow of democracy with the use of ballot box?
No, I'm not surprised. I am surprised by how much the media is trying to make this and say this. I mean, quite frankly, with Putin having an 82 to 83% approval rating, and this is being done by international polling, not internal polling. It's hard to believe otherwise and things. And if you look at the statistics of the voting, the least they got in any constituency was 36%. The most they got was 96% for the thing. So it's an expected result.
Why do you think the Western media has been so critical of the democratic elections in Russia, despite, I mean, all the glow of democracy itself?
Well, Western media is always critical about, not about the elections as such, but they're always critical about any result of any elections when somebody is elected whom they don't like. So, and any elections can be, there are no ideal elections in the world.
Are you saying that the American media, for example, don't quite like President Duterte of the Philippines because they don't like this guy?
Sure, and I'm sure next time they're going to say that the elections were rigged there, even if he is elected.
Don't you think this is a little bit too cynical about the results of democratic elections?
So it depends on which kind of definition of a democracy, which kind of standard we will take. Because now, I think, especially from the perspective of Russia, there is not only a model of democracy, just like the United States or some other European countries. And also, as we know, democracy is not only an idea, not only a system, it's a technology. For example, how could you try to look for a good or proper process to to express the public opinion, just like our American colleague mentioned that once there is a very, very high popularity to Mr. Putin, and also as we know, this United Russia Party is another word of Mr. Putin. So it's not a surprise for this party to get so many support. But of course, how it will happen, maybe from the perspective of American or some other European country, it's a kind of a illiberal democracy. So it's another democracy, but finally it's a democracy.
Alexander, despite the fact that Beijing and Moscow have been very special friends since the years of Boris Yeltsin with the end of the Cold War, I'm afraid not as many Chinese follow your domestic politics as closely as our awareness about the campaign changes or interactions in the United States between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So tell us briefly, which are the major opposition parties in the Russia Duma?
We don't have, well, it depends on what you call opposition.
You mean you don't have serious opposition in the parliament?
Well, there are 4 parties there, and the same parties were elected this time. Neither of them are in the opposition to Mr. Putin, so they don't criticize Mr. Putin himself as president. But they criticize the government and criticize the ruling party. So from that point of view, they can be called opposition. So there is, apart from United Russia, there's the Liberal Democratic Party, which is actually a kind of right-wing party. There is also Just Russia Party, which is more like social democratic. And there's also the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is kind of very strange type of communism. So these are the 4 parties. If you ask them, they would say to you that they are opposition parties. But there were also parties that took part in the elections. There were more than 10 of them, which were very critical of Mr. Putin, especially one party which is called the Party of People's Freedom. And the debate was quite open on the TV. They called him thief, called him all kinds of bad words, and they got like 0.7%, like less than 1%.
How was the campaign like? I mean, did you have any presidential debates?
Sure. Well, it's not presidential because the elections were not presidential.
Party
debates, yes. A lot of debates.
Forgive me for asking the stupid question, because everybody immediately goes back to, or looks forward to what would happen in the year 2018 when President Putin is most likely to become the sole most convincing presidential hopeful on behalf of course, the United Russia.
If you choose to stand.
But I think he's in a position where he will stand, and quite frankly, you know, there are elements to this that should be considered. There was a massive downturn in the participation, which went down to 48% of the electorate, down from 60% in 2011. So there seems to be, yes, I agree, the opposition is not there, but it seems to be a little bit more of voter apathy about this, or they were very certain what the outcome would be. In 2011, there was wide-scale allegations of voter fraud. I mean, actually people caught on camera stuffing the ballot box and things like that. But I think you can make too much of it. It certainly would have happened. My guess is that it didn't really change it. And if you look at the polling statistics, there was nothing that would entertain that another government would have been elected.
Yes, the world was watching what was happening in Russia in those days when the alleged vote rigging became headline-making stories for those who followed the political process in Russia. But do you think serious reforms have been undertaken ever since to make sure that no such accusations would take place again? For example, the single constituency district, what does that mean for the guaranteeing a clean campaign?
The electoral system changed many times in Russia. Last time it was only party lists, but this time it was half constituencies and half party. So there are 450 members of the Duma, 225 are elected on party lists, and 225 in single constituencies. So well, there is a discussion everywhere about which exactly electoral system is the best, but they decided to do that, and there are pluses and minuses. But I don't think it does anything to make elections more fair. It does something to represent different types of the population. For example, in a constituency, you vote exactly for a person, not for the party. So you know whom are you voting for exactly. But the result is basically the same, because the political party, the ruling party, was the most popular. I don't think that the rigging did not change anything. Maybe it got a little more than it really was worth.
But Hong Jian, excuse me, Hong Jian, despite the poor economic performance under the leadership of President Putin, why did the ruling party of United Russia still win so big?
So that's a big question from this result of the election, because so far, as we know, certainly domestically there are very big economic difficulty, and now, but at the same time, very high popularity of Mr. Putin.
Why?
Yeah.
The question is, what's the driving force behind the campaign
We can find
success?
maybe some message from this presentation after the election from Mr. Putin, say that, okay, even now we are facing difficulties, but still, these Russian people still have confidence with us because we are serving for the people. So now there is, I think, a potential problem for the Russian politics is we don't know. We could not make clear where is the resources of popularity of Mr. Putin and the ruling party, because if this support from average people to Mr. Putin, because his personality or his achievement as a president, or he want to do some economic reform, but in reality, he could not do something. So we could not make a clear message from this popularity to the person, to the party, or to the policy.
Well, I mean, from the American point of view, what we see is they respect somebody who's very, very strong. The fact that he did take in Crimea in 2014 was a sign to a group of people who felt very injured by the breakup of the USSR. He appeals very, very strongly to this kind of national sentiment of maybe even putting back parts of the USSR, at least drawing the line very clearly between what they see as a hostile NATO and the US against what they saw were traditional areas of influence within Russia. They are never going back on that. I think that is the main issue, and it's the only way you can really explain why they would go forward with him, despite the fact that the economy is weakening.
To what degree do you think the populist charisma of President Putin has helped him win the campaign? I mean, help his party win the campaign?
I don't think it played a very serious role, because during the campaign, Putin was very careful. He never said he supported that party. Only once he kind of hinted that he would vote for it, but without naming it by name.
Who's the chairman of United Russia at this moment?
The Prime Minister, Mr. Medvedev.
Medvedev.
Yeah, so I think this is not actually because of Mr. Putin, but because the situation is not that bad, actually. Of course, it's worse than before a little bit, but it's still much better than in the 1990s. And people may be not very much enthusiastic. We did not say here that the turnout was very low. It was the lowest in history. It was less than 50%. So most people just didn't vote. They didn't bother to vote because they were not enthusiastic, as I said, but at the same time, they are not worrying too much about the future, because if they did, they would have voted for somebody else, for some other party. So the situation is not that bad. The nationalist feelings are there. This is correct. And many people don't see that, despite the fact that there are some problems, this party, this government, this president is still the best choice, and there's no alternative to them. The thing is, that there was an alternative. There were real opposition parties who criticized the government, who criticized the president, but they all got less than 3%.
Well, I have a strong feeling, Alexander. It's not because you have a strong united Russia, but the opposition is too weak. Is that the fundamental reason behind the crushing victory? But you are watching Dialogue with Anna Tangen, Alexander Lukin, and Cui Hongjian. We are discussing the latest crushing victory of the parliamentary elections in Russia, with the United Russia, the ruling party, winning very big. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Yeah, undoubtedly, President Putin enjoys a tremendous popularity, not only in Russia, but he's got a big army of fans in China. But the question is, does it because Russia have a very powerful military force, despite the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, for example, why it seems that most of the taxpayers in your country still support the military intervention of Moscow in Syria? And the 7-day ceasefire has fallen apart, and Russia was accused by the United States of bombing a UN convoy whose mission was to provide refugees and the victims of the war with humanitarian assistance.
Well, first of all, the U.S. Says all kinds of bad things about Russia. Russia, of course, say that it was not their forces, Russia's forces, which bombed convoy. The thing is, but generally, yes, Mr. Putin managed to reform the Russian armed forces, which were in a very bad shape before, and showed on several occasions its new effectiveness. And Syria is the most obvious case. And this is one of the factors of the population. Also this campaign goes on very well. Russia lost very few people there, and but everyone can see on the TV that, how Russia does the bombing, and everyone thinks that, see, it's not only the United States who can do it, like live bombing of terrorist targets, but Russia can also do it, and this is one of the factors. As for the taxes, according to the government, it does not increase the military budget. So the money is taken from for Syria. It is taken from the existing budget, but generally the military budget is growing, and the opposition criticizes it. But as you said, the opposition lost. So.
I'm going to disagree with this. I mean, the Syrian situation is not about how many people are being lost in the U.S. or Russia. It's a humanitarian disaster where hundreds of thousands of people have died and millions are being displaced, and we're feeling the economic and political outswings from that all over the world. So I don't think that it's a question of who should be beating their chest and claiming their right. There's no doubt, in addition to things on the American side, there was a bunch of troops, 29 troops that were killed. The issue is, are they going tit for tat on this situation, and where is that leading to? So I also think on the military thing, remember, the USSR collapsed in part because of the expenditures that were being made on the military side as opposed to the civilian side.
Particularly the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which had drained your financial strength a lot. Let's look at...
sorry, I was asked what people think, not about the situation itself. Mm-hmm. Maybe the people are wrong, but I'm not sure. But that's what they think.
But Hongjian, what does the campaign success of the United Russia mean for China-Russia relationship?
With
the campaign success, what does that mean?
For China? You mean?
Yeah.
You mean this Duma?
Yes, of course. I'm asking you, what does this mean for the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Beijing?
Yeah.
Since Putin will enjoy a very stable approval rating,
yeah, and
his political support is very critical.
Regarding the impact on the China-Russia relations in future, I think we need to answer the question firstly. It will support enough, the result of the election of the reign of Mr. Putin in the next presidential election, because also it looks like now China and Russia is getting closer and closer as partners, and certainly a stability of Russian politics is good news for China, because once there is a stable political leader in Russia, which means there will be a continuity of cooperation between China and Russia. Also, we know how many contracts or deals has been done between two countries, and how ambitious cooperation for two countries, along with the Belt and Road Initiative, and even the connection between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasia Economic Union proposed by Russia. So certainly, it's a good news for the China-Russia relations in the future.
And do you think a very good, constructive and stable relationship with Beijing will help generate jobs back in Russia, and that will in return help the United Russia win big in the election?
Well, in theory, it's a match made in heaven. You have a heavily resource-rich country that could be exporting a lot of things to China, and China, of course, has the ability to add value to things and ship out goods. So in theory, it's very good. But there's been a traditional relationship of distrust. I think a lot of that is what's happening now in terms of Russia and China together is being led by the US.
What do you mean by distrust between the two countries?
Well, you had a little falling out in the 50s, as I recall, and there was the move in the 70s towards the US, which was basically playing the US card against Russia at that time. There's also Vietnam. There have been other things in North Korea and things like this. There have been differences of opinion and policy. So I don't know that it's always been very smooth. The question is, will they get together? Will you have China and Russia continuing to get together because of the U.S. pressure on encirclement campaigns, pivot to Asia, the types of things that have done this? Because I think otherwise there would be perhaps more distance between these three.
Right. What do you think of the growing presence of Chinese labor in the Far East Siberia? There have been allegations that some of the members in the Russian Duma are skeptical about the intent of those Chinese, quote-unquote, new immigrants from China, and their ambition is to sort of take back the territory. I mean, what do you think of their suspicions?
I think it's a myth. If you go there, you can see it for yourself. There are there are almost no Chinese in that territory. There are actually more Chinese in Moscow than in the Far East. And the Chinese people, they don't like the climate. They don't want to go there and to settle there. Of course, there are some tourists. There are some, people who, businessmen who go there. But it's a myth which is used by some political forces. Just
Russian or overseas political forces?
Both Russian and overseas, especially pro-Western Russians who say that China is so bad it only wants to take Russian territory and stuff like that. But this means that they don't understand the real situation.
And do you think the recently concluded Far East Economic Forum in Vladivostok was part of the diplomatic efforts of President Putin to maintain a balance between China and other neighboring economies in Northeast Asia, so that you will reduce excessive dependence on the Chinese market?
Well, our relationship with China is very strong. It's strategic partnership, and we invite more Chinese investment. What is very interesting that after the Ukrainian crisis, Russia allowed Chinese investment into oil and gas business, for example, which was not allowed before. And we invite Chinese investment and help, as I said, but it does mean that we don't invite other countries. We also invite Japan, South Korea, and we just want to, Russia wants to develop cooperation with everybody, just like China does. It's not balancing, it's just, it's a competition.
Yes.
What about the other two geopolitical issues, Hong Jian? For example, Russia and China successfully concluded a joint naval exercise in South China Sea, and everybody was aware the message it sent was somehow targeting a third party, despite the denials from both Moscow and Beijing that this is just one of the joint military exercises that we've been doing over the past years. What do you think of the impact?
Yes, also that now between China and Russia we call a kind of comprehensive and coordination partnership. What does it mean? Which means that especially for China and Russia, they do have a relation as a strategic dependence, especially when China and Russia are facing some maybe pressure from the United States. So I think that's a very, very big value for this cooperation. But of course, China and Russia, I would like to say, both two countries need to take care of the spillover effect of this cooperation. Because that's also the reason why both China and the Russian government emphasized again and again that even China and Russia get closer and closer, but never China and Russia will become alliance. So I think it shows, how to say, especially from China's perspective, a responsibility to keep a strategic balance in the world.
China is angry with the deployment of a THAAD missile shield program in ROK. Russia did join China in criticizing Seoul for following the American advice in deploying such a program, which could be viewed as a common threat to the national security of both Russia and China. But your perspective about the Russian response, I mean, perhaps my feeling is that not so many Russians care so much about the THAAD program as the Chinese do.
Mm-hmm. Also, we know that regarding to this THAAD system, or in other words, this anti-missile system, it's also a very big concern for Russia, because also we know that the first time, I mean, the split between Russia and the United States after the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War, is this anti-missile system deployed in Poland and some other Eastern European countries more than 10 years ago. So I think at this moment, the THAAD gave maybe similar feeling to Russia and China, say that, okay, maybe it's just a part of the strategy of containing China and Russia from other countries like that. So I think, yes, to some degree, both China and Russia share some, similar feeling. So of course, from United States or other countries, yes, I think this country need to have some more explanation or more exchange with Russia and China, because I think anyway, no matter which kind of alliance you have, the mutual trust is important.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a very long discussion, but we are running out of time. Thank you again for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.